Hey everybody, welcome back to Grain Markets and Other Stuff. This is what is the date today? December 7th. It's Monday night, 7 p.m. We've got Chris Barron from AgView Solutions with us. Chris, you doing all right tonight?
Doing good. How are you doing?
I'm doing good. I appreciate you coming on the podcast and the YouTube and the Facebook and the whole social media deal with me tonight. For any of you out there who are watching, I want a couple of housekeeping items here before we get started. Anybody out there who's watching, if you have questions, drop them in either the comments on YouTube or the comments on Facebook, and we will see them and we will try to answer any questions that you might have here on the live stream. And remember, if you want to go back and watch this, the video is going to live forever on YouTube and on Facebook after this. So if you have to step away tonight for some reason, you'll be able to go back and watch it tomorrow. And I'm going to post it as an audio only episode of the podcast also. So this is the second edition of what I'm calling the Grain Marketing 101 series, and it's called Know Your Numbers. And I have only, Chris, you're actually only the second guest that's ever been on the show. And I tend to bring in a guest when there's something that I feel like I can't necessarily discuss entirely on my own. And this Know Your Numbers conversation, I thought that first off, I probably couldn't do it totally on my own. And second off, I thought very first, you were probably the guy to have. So, Chris, why don't you talk about yourself for a minute? You run a farm in Iowa. AgView Solutions is your business. Tell everybody a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. Yeah. So as Joe said, I farm in Northeast Iowa. We're just kind of about halfway between Cedar Rapids and Waterloo, Iowa. So we're kind of in that eastern central part of the state. We're about 25 minutes from the largest ethanol plant, ADM, Cedar Rapids, Iowa. They burn through about 1 million bushel of corn per day. So we're pretty lucky from a basis standpoint being in that area. So I grew up in this area on the family farm. We raised hogs for the first 20 years of my life, and then kind of got more involved in our family seed business, and then more into crop operations. We started working with farmers on cost of production analysis about 27 years ago now, going into year 27. So
I didn't know it was that long. I didn't know it's been that long.
Yeah, time flies when you're having fun, and some of this gray stuff starts to come, I guess, as you get a little more experience. But it's been a lot of years of working with producers. It's been extremely rewarding. We learned so much from producers, and the goal is to just to keep that information circulating back and forth to growers. And so our family operation, we farm in conjunction with about 8 other farm operations. We have 1 line of machinery, and crop yields this year were pretty good, but not quite as good as expected, but we'll survive and make out okay this year and be back at it again next year. So
now, you said 25 years ago is when you started helping farmers with cost of production and that sort of stuff.
Yeah, when we got out of the hog business, my dad challenged me. I had all kinds of data on our pork production side of things. I knew pigs per sow per year. I knew feed efficiency. I had all the numbers dialed in really close. Mm-hmm. We really didn't know a lot on the crop side of things. We didn't track the numbers as specifically as we should have. And so my dad challenged me. He said, you need to dial in your numbers. If we're going to get rid of these hogs, we need to figure out how to grow crops and how to do it profitably. And so that challenge brought me to a college roommate, a friend of mine, that we sat down and we developed Profit Manager. So when we came up with that many years ago, it's developed since then. Just working on trying to figure out how do we dial in these numbers? How do we look at things better? And how do we make better economic decisions as it relates to marketing and purchasing and machinery and equipment management and just all the challenges we have? But it's been pretty cool to watch it evolve, because we've built it by what farmers have asked for. I want to know this, I want to know that, I want to know my costs of certain areas. And so we've just built it over the years to the point where it is now, which you'll see in a bit.
And when we hear people talk about grain marketing, the phrase "know your numbers" or "know your cost of production," we hear that tossed around so much. And if people are to ask me, say, Joe, what's the number one thing you should know in regard to grain marketing? I mean, knowing your own numbers is without a doubt the biggest thing. Why do you think knowing your numbers is important, and what does it do for you? What does it do for your customers?
Well, I think number one, there's a perception and then there's reality. So there's a perception of what you think your numbers are, and then there's the reality of what they are. And sometimes we want to know, but we don't want to know. In other words, sometimes they may not be as good as we think, or we're just apprehensive about really knowing them.
Well, the truth is terrifying sometimes.
Yeah. Well, one of my partners always says you can either be informed or you can be happy. And, and some people just choose happy, but I think informed allows you to make better decisions so that you can eventually be happy. And, what I see a lot though, when we work with producers is we'll have a grower call us and they'll say, hey, I want to know what my cost of production is better. But I think I'm doing a pretty good job. And most operations are anymore from the standpoint of knowing how to manage the accounting side of their business. So they have a really good accounting system. They have a really good accrual system. The problem is we have to do predictive analysis. In other words, what we'll do tonight is we'll look at 2021. We're going to say, okay, what's coming our way? We got to, just like the futures market, you got to be able to predict and to be able to analyze what's coming at you. And so that's really what we try to do with Profit Manager is to create some predictive analysis so that you can make those future sales, you can make those decisions. Because usually what happens is you have a really short period of time to make those decisions. And so you need to really be able to put some numbers together, feel confident in them, and then be able to take that futures position.
I had this topic a little bit further down my list, but you brought it up, so I'm going to ask you about it. You talked about accounting, and then you talked about forecasting, and there's a big difference. Ag accounting is not the same as what you do. What is the difference?
Well, again, what we try to do is we try to help producers take the numbers from last year and not just roll them over and use the same numbers. Like a lot of people will roll a cash flow over from the prior year and just move the numbers over and change the acres or something. What we want to do is we want to populate those numbers and create a live version of what our plan is. And so this is an evolving thing. Your numbers are constantly changing. It's a moving target. So you got to watch this and you got to continue to dial these in because, when our margins are as tight as they are, you can be off 7, 8, 10 cents a bushel on corn, for example, and that might be your margin. And so really what we're trying to do is every single line item expense, instead of just, categorizing machinery cost or fuel cost or, healthcare cost or whatever it is, from an expense standpoint, we're trying to categorize these things. And then we look at these things in terms of a cost per bushel, a cost per unit, so that we can make better decisions rather than what we're writing a check out for. And I'll talk more about that in a minute when we show you the program too.
Yeah, and there definitely is a difference between what your accountant or what your CPA can do for you and what a guy like Chris can do for you. They're two totally different things. They're both necessary things, but farm accounting and farm budgeting, I think, are two totally different things.
Yeah.
Do you want to bring that slide you had, that first one up, and I'll throw it on the screen here. Here we go. Let me see here. Here we go. Okay, 7 keys to knowing your numbers. Give me a quick rundown of what we're looking at here.
Yeah, so I'll start with this and we'll finish with it. But we're going to talk a little bit about just the key of knowing, all of your expenses, pulling everything in that you have. And so, like I said, a lot of times, we want to be happy, but sometimes maybe our costs tend to be a little higher than maybe what we think they are. And sometimes it's not so bad, but it really is all about pulling everything in. Number 2 is about accurate numbers. It's really about making sure that we spend the time that we need to extract the numbers from what we've really done, whether it's seed or crop protection or machinery and equipment or whatever it is. What did we actually spend? What do we actually forecast that we're going to spend from one year to the next? Number 3 is just updating and reviewing these numbers often. Just as markets are a moving target, so is your cost of production and so is your yield. So it's really those 3 key variables that create a really consistent moving target. So you've got yield, price, and cost that are all moving, and they don't move synergistically, they move separate. And so we got to keep an eye on all 3 of those. Number 4 is just knowing what your bushels are as a percent. And I'll talk about that here in a little bit and the importance of that. But, you know, a lot of times what we see is people have thought they've made sales. They sold 10,000 here, 10,000 there, maybe 5,000 bushel there, but it only ended up being like 6 or 7% of their sales because their farm operation has grown. Mm-hmm. And so we really need to dial in on, you know, what is 10% of your bushels by crop, so that when you make these incremental sales, they mean something. And then knowing your break even, I think, is really important at every yield level. Again, production is the number one thing that impacts your bottom line cost of production, and the number one thing that impacts profitability. Marketing is very important, but if you don't have anything to sell, that doesn't do you much good either. And so you need to really keep a close eye on that yield and manage that throughout the growing season. Number 6 is margin target. I'm a big proponent of not setting price targets. I want a margin first. I want to know how much money I want to make. And then I want to know where my cost of production is. And then when I add my margin to that, that becomes my price target, rather than chasing the market and chasing a price. And we can debate on that in a little bit. And then number 7 is just applying the numbers. And so it's a communication thing. It's like, you know, everybody that's watching this, listening to this now, I think this is a key thing, is constantly educating ourselves. And it's working with somebody like you, Joe, or somebody that can help us understand how to apply these numbers, how to use the right marketing tools to manage those margins. And then it's about staying disciplined, you know, and sticking with the plan, but yet being flexible. And so that's kind of what I wanted to touch on with that piece there, if that makes sense.
What if you had a guess, Chris, what percentage of farmers in your experience really actually know their numbers? They actually know what you're showing me on the screen here. And I see you've got a budget up here.
Yeah. And we'll get to that in a second, but I guess I would say it's a low percentage that are accurate. A lot of people know their numbers, or they think they know their numbers. And I would say it's kind of the 80-20 rule with everything. It seems like, you know, probably 80% of people think they know their numbers, and a lot of them do pretty well, but only 20% of them are probably accurate to the degree they need to be. Mm-hmm. So mainly because the margin is so tight. And if you're off on your cost of production by 10 or 15 cents a bushel, that's an issue. And a lot of times I get some kickback on the yield. Well, I don't know what my yield is. Well, nobody knows what your yield's going to be for sure, but you know what your 5-year yield average is. And if you don't establish a target, you have nothing to shoot at. And so, you know, I'm a huge proponent of getting that 5-year actual production history in front of you, not an APH number, but what do you actually produce on a 5-year yield average? And I've got a few guys that actually use a 10-year, and they'll use an Olympic average. So they'll kick out the highest and the lowest yield, and they'll use a 10-year. And that works pretty good too. So there's just different ways to plug these numbers in. But I think a person has to be confident in these numbers, so that then you can make decisions and be disciplined with the decisions. So if that makes sense.
Before you get into the nitty gritty here, so the yield thing, you know, every year during the growing season, of course, is a moving target. It's moving almost every day with weather conditions and that sort of stuff, right? Yep. When you're talking about price, it's the exact same thing. Do you advise that most of these guys look at their spreadsheets? I mean, on a daily basis? Is it a weekly basis? Is it how often do you recommend that a guy looks at this stuff?
I think you look at it as needed. And so every time you make a change, I think you need to look at it because the target starts to move. Mm-hmm. So if you are, for example, you get to summertime, it's always funny to me. People have a hard time spending money on, say, for example, fungicide. Becomes emotional because lines of credit are getting full. And, you know, look at those numbers, see what your cost of production is, see where your average marketing price is, what do you have left to sell, factor in those actual prices, and then let those things dictate some of these decisions on the cost side of things as you purchase things. And also, I think, you know, when you look at the yield, and as that's changing, that's going to change a lot of these decisions. And so I think if you look at this every single week, it's a good thing, because, you know, things are changing around you all the time. And the more you look at it, the more you're going to use it. And I'll show you in a minute too, where we track the marketing. And I think a person should have their cost production tool should be interconnected to your numbers. So when you're doing your marketing, your numbers are right on that same book. So I'm not saying it has to be Profit Manager, but whatever you use, you should have those things both interconnected so that when you're looking at your marketing, you have direct connectivity to the cost side of things.
Hey, Chris, bring that sheet up again on your screen. Why don't you talk about some of the numbers that you track? And one question that I have in particular that you could talk about maybe as you go, what are some of the numbers that people are missing consistently or are always off on or maybe fail to consider? I guess that's do your rundown, but see if you can kind of answer those questions too.
Well, I'm going to answer your first question first then, because it's the top line.
Mm-hmm.
So you can see my mouse here moving around, right?
Yes.
Okay. So on line 9 here, where it says return to management, what that category means is that's your overhead costs. That's your payroll for your employees. That's your owner draw. That's your healthcare costs. That's kids that are in college and you got payments on that, or utilities and different things like that, or you accidentally bought a boat and you got a payment on that boat. And those,
I've done that.
Yeah, and those things occur with farmers as well. And so when we have these expenses and that money has to come out of this bucket, it has to be entered in terms of a cost on a per acre basis. And so this is the summary. I'll get to how you populate the detail here in a minute. But I see this category missing a lot. And I'm going to just jump over here real quick because I want to see what this is. So if you look at this return to management category here on our corn page for Profit Manager, there's that 44.80.87, and that's just where we're at on average right now with our average client. That's 6.2% of the cost of production. Average acres for our clients right now is 21.97. But when you look at that, that's it's going to take 11 bushel of corn to cover that. Okay, it's 23 cents a bushel of your total cost of production of our clients of the data we have in here yet. By the way, we only got about probably 15 or 20% of our profit managers in here. So it's a low amount of data. And again, these numbers here that you're looking at, don't get hung up on these numbers. Again, like you said in the very beginning, Joe, it's putting your own numbers in this type of tool that's so critically important. But the key is what is the cost for your overhead costs that, you just asked, what are people missing? Well, in this case, it's 23 cents a bushel. Well, you'd start making sales 23 cents too soon if you don't have all of your costs in here. So that's why having them all included is so important. And again, what is it as a percent of cost?
Gosh, that's got to be a highly variable number too, from farm to farm. I mean, that's probably got to be about it's one of the most highly variable.
It's the most wide ranging of all the categories we have. So that's a good point. Usually what we see is anywhere from, sometimes it's a positive number. So if it's a producer and a spouse that has off-farm income coming in, or there's another business generating revenue that comes back into the farm, we've seen this number be positive occasionally. And we've also seen this number as high as over $200, $250 an acre, I think is the highest I've seen. But usually when that number is extremely high, that means that the land is probably paid for and they're drawing that money out for cost of living or paying other family members or just using it as profit back to the owners.
I see.
And so that category is relative. And that's why I'm not a big fan of benchmarking. There's places where you can benchmark yourself against somebody else. My challenge to everybody listening to this is, do you track your numbers? Do you have your final numbers? And can you benchmark against yourself? Because that's what means something. Because you can benchmark against somebody else, and if their situation's completely different, that information's meaningless.
Right.
And so that's why I think it's so important. Back to this, excuse me. Back to this report here, though. This is giving you a report here in this first column of your corn. I've populated it with the soybeans, and then I haven't yet put wheat in here, but it'll dump wheat in side by side. Or we have some Canadian clients that use this that have as many as, I think, 8 or 9 crops. So what we like to do is we like to put these crops side by side so that we can see what the profitability is on those. And just from the standpoint of breaking things out, these are the categories And, if you're watching this later, these categories, you can kind of look at land payment, taxes, interest, insurance, seed, fertilizer, nitrogen, herbicides, fungicides, insecticides, basically crop protection products, custom applications, and that's specifically for spraying, for applications for crop protection. And then we have a machinery and equipment category, which I'll talk about more in a minute, grain hauling, drying, and storage. Those categories we've determined over, like I said, plus 26 years of doing this, going into 27 of doing this. This is telling us these are probably the key, not probably, these are the key categories that over the years we've determined that we really need to know. I won't go into it right now, but we do have a budgeting tool. It's in a tab here. I think everybody from that return to management category, you really need to have a budget for overhead expenses that's separate from your cost of production, so you can just dump a budget number into your cost of production analysis for your marketing. And I'll show you that here in a bit. So any questions on this page, and I'll hit the corn page quick and show you.
No, go ahead and jump to the corn page. Oh, real quick. I see a bunch of people have jumped onto the live stream here in the last 15 minutes. If you have any questions, real time here, I'm watching the comments on YouTube and Facebook. Feel free to chime in with questions, and I'd be happy to either answer them or ask Chris for you if you're watching and you want to chime in. All right, yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so really what we try to do is, again, we want a page for each individual crop, and then we want them to report back to this report page, so that ultimately at the top here, you can see we get to a total income, a total expense, total revenue, a per acre profitability level, or hopefully a profitability level, and what's that ROI, what's that return to management look like for the operation. And again, just for anybody that's just jumped on, this average acres here, this 3856 is just happens to be an average of the client database that we have in here currently. So again, don't get too hung up on these numbers. Again, it's just so important that you put your own in there. Average land cost, when we look at land, what we do is we add up what your cash rent payments are, what your principal and interest payments are, and we divide that by the total acres. So in this case, this $448,000 would be accumulation of cash rents, principal and interest payments divided by total acres. And that's how we come up with this land cost. And again, it's very different from, say, North Dakota or New York or somewhere than it is from, say, Texas or, central Illinois or middle of Iowa or whatever. Those numbers are going to widely vary, and why it's so important. But again, property tax, we just dump in there whatever your property tax is and divide that by total acres. That number is going to end up being smaller in some cases. This group that I have in here right now, obviously, I think is probably about 50-50 owned and cash rented, it looks like, based on where that number is right now. But that number gets lower the more you rent, the more you own, the higher that number is, obviously divided on a per acre basis. Interest, basically that's just on operating, because we have land interest up here and we put all the machinery and equipment interest in a category I'll show you here in a second. Crop insurance, that's just, what's your crop insurance premium for crop insurance. The next category is seed cost. And again, we'll let's go back up and pick on insurance for a second. I have a lot of people sometimes questioning between, say, 75, 80, 85, and some of these add-on products that they're talking about this year, I think are real important to consider, because when you look at crop insurance, and in this case right now, it's of the operations I have in here with their projected premiums, that's only, just shy of 3% of their total cost of production, or 10 cents a bushel. How many options can we buy for, 10 cents a bushel, Joe?
On corn, you could do some pretty substantial risk management.
Right. So, so if you look at this, we start looking at, okay, let's add on some risk protection with some of the options. Buy your crop insurance, know what you've got invested on a per bushel basis, just like you do with your option strategies. And that's why I think it's so important to know what these are. With seed cost, every year it seems like seed, crop protection, some of these high level input costs seem to rise every year. But a lot of times, maybe they don't rise as much as we think we do. If you look at the average corn increase, somewhere between 2.5 and 3.5 bushel yield increase annually every single year. But what's the seed cost going up? Is it going up about what you're getting extra for value? And so it's really looking at what's that cost per bushel, what is it as a percent of cost, and how's it compared to last year? And looking at that technology. And that's why, again, it's so important to look at your own information from one year to the next. Fertilizer and lime here in this category, and then nitrogen, obviously, for corn or wheat or whatever. Crop protection here, chemicals. It's always interesting to me as farmers. Sometimes we spend a lot of time beating up the crop protection person. I don't sell crop protection, but if you look at it over here, it's 18 cents a bushel. So, okay, we drop this number here down by, let's drop it down to, even $25, take $10 off of that. What it change your cost 5 cents? I don't know about you, Joe, but I screw my marketing up more than 5 cents a bushel.
It's easy to do.
On just one decision, so, you want dead weeds. I mentioned that crop, the crop protection and yield is so important to the bottom line. And I think we got to be careful on what costs we cut. We want to make sure if we're cutting costs, we aren't cutting things that are going to impact yield. On the machinery and equipment.
Hey, great, Chris. I had one question come in here on insurance. Is the insurance cost crop only? Or I think the question is, are you incorporating different sorts of insurance?
Okay, so all of your life insurance and casualty and all and vehicle insurance and all that, your buildings and home insurance and all that stuff would all be in your budget and would all fall in this category here of return to management, because those are all compensation things that are back to the business. And we have a budget page. This is the budget page here. I'm not going to spend any time on it, but just to kind of show you, we have all of our categories here. And whenever you work through this type of a program, you need to make sure that all of this stuff's interconnected so that way your budgeting can feed back to this return to management category, and then instantly.
So that insurance line, though, that line 15 there, that's just crop insurance.
Yes, that's just crop insurance.
I think that was the question. Okay.
Yep. I get carried away because I start having fun with the numbers. So you gotta rail me in once in a while here.
No, it's all right. Keep going.
So, all right. And so again, here's a fungicide, other crop protection, insecticides or whatever, any custom applications, the machinery. These numbers here, I think are very interesting. A lot of times, and you can do it a couple of different ways here. You can come in here and you can plug in the total value of your machinery. And then what we do is we plug in 25%, and then that'll give us a quick equipment cost. I don't like doing that. We can do that with people if we want to get a real quick number. But it's very important, right here in this operation data set, we're looking at 62 cents a bushel. I would challenge anybody that's listening, and some of you guys I know probably already know this, because if you're working with me, you do know this number. But, what's your cost on a per bushel basis for your machinery? For your equipment fleet, what is that?
That was one of the things you said when we talked before that people got wrong consistently.
Yeah, and it's okay. I mean, but what we do is and I'll just show you real quick. We go in here and we plug in these costs on a per pass basis for your machinery, and we do this for every operation. So this is an example of a planter. We plug in the equipment value, we plug in the power unit value, and we plug in the percent of use. And then from there, we look at logistical overhead costs, we look at fuel consumption, we look at labor, and then we also use this 25% category, which what we've seen with machinery and equipment over the last couple of years is that we've had a fairly high inflation rate on new equipment. And we've, at the same time, for the last 6 years, because commodity prices have been under pressure, there's been a slow update of the machinery and equipment fleet to the point where, a lot of us are actually behind probably where we'd like to be with updating equipment. And so now when you say, for example, you look at a sprayer that maybe costs, the last time you bought a sprayer maybe was 6 or 7 years ago, maybe 8 years ago, and it was $250,000. Now that same sprayer is $400,000. Well, if we are not calculating in as part of our cost of production the inflation, we're putting in an inaccurate number, because if you're not going to stop farming at the end of that period of time, then your cost is going up. Even though you're not writing a check, you have an inflationary component plus the depreciation component. And so when we calculate these numbers, they're not going to match your accounting. We're forecasting what your cost actually is. And so in this case, this is 2,200 acres. This planter here, the cost on a per pass basis is $26.92. If that were my farm operation, I would want to know what my cost is, as opposed to know what the local university says it should cost to plant corn, because I guarantee you that everybody listening to this has a different number. And so it's so important that we know our own numbers on each pass that we do to cover our machinery and equipment fleet, so that we get to that number. Is it 62 cents? Is it 72 cents? What is that number? And the only way you get to that number is to identify what these individual prices here are on a per pass basis of the passes that are applicable to your operation. So machinery and equipment is the second largest line item expense. You can see here on this data set right now, they're at 16.8% of the total cost. It's one of the biggest ones. It's the second biggest next to land.
So it's one of the biggest ones, and it's one of the ones that people probably have the biggest problems with, or maybe get wrong the most.
Well, and you have that, plus you have, a lot of people wondering, well, when should I trade? When should, where's my cost? Is it where it should be? The other thing that is interesting too is, as I say, it's the second largest expense. In some areas, it's the largest expense. You go into like North Dakota, South Dakota, in some areas where they don't have $300 or $350 an acre rent, like we do in Iowa, Illinois, and some of the I states where you have some really high rents. It's the largest line item expense, I guess is what I'm saying, for some of the northern states. So then when you look here, we've got grain handling, your hauling charge. It's always interesting. A lot of us know, okay, well, I know what it's costing me to haul my grain. Let's say, for example, it's 14 cents. Another way to think about it is, what's it costing you per acre? So like in this example here, it's 14 cents to haul it, 9 cents to dry it, 4 cents to store it. That's $53 an acre. So a lot of times when we think in terms of per bushel, we need to think in terms of per acre. And when we think in terms of per acre, we need to think in terms of per bushel, so that we look at things from a three-dimensional perspective, rather than looking at these expenses and saying, okay, I'm pretty good here, because it changes your perspective. It changes how you look at these things. And, if you're measuring it, you can improve it. But if you're not measuring it and looking at these things from different angles, it really can make it so it's really hard to improve from there. So on the bottom of the report page, what it does is we plug in the yield, the actual average yield that's being projected from this data set that I've got in here. They're at 196. Their average yield or average price projection is actually 410, but that's with a 15-cent basis projection. Some of them have it locked, some of them don't. And then we're using nothing for government payments and nothing for other income this year. We pretty much did that last year. We pretty much do that every year, unless it's a known government payment like a CRP or something that for sure you're going to get. Then you can plug it in there. But if you
There's not really any way that you could budget for it. I mean, unless all this stuff seems to come up during the year. There's not any way you could budget for that stuff prior. I mean, in the vast majority of cases, at least as of late. Right.
And I just plugged in $10,000. So let's say these farmers on average get $10,000. That's 2 cents a bushel.
Right.
So and people always tend to think in terms of, it's $4.55 an acre. You need to know almost instantaneously, you're going to get a check for 100,000. What is that? Or you're going to get a check for whatever, or you're going to spend a check for whatever. $100,000, that's $45 an acre or 23 cents a bushel in this scenario. It changes the ROI, and by how much. And so all of these things need to be interconnected, because when you call somebody and say, hey, here's, we're getting real close to your target, how long does that last?
Right.
I mean, a lot of times we have like 5 minutes to make a decision. So you need to have this stuff in front of you so that you can run scenarios instantaneously, I guess is kind of the message there. But we also look at crop insurance here. We'll plug in, once we get to that time of year, we'll plug in the coverage level a person wants to buy, where their APH is, what the spring price is. And then we know what the insured coverage level is. Then what we do is we kind of look at that gap between the level of coverage they have and what their cost of production is. And then you kind of know how many dollars you have at risk, with your operation. So you really can understand what the risk scenario looks like. So then on the bottom line, and this all prints out on one page. And again, like I said in the beginning, my dad challenged me, put it all on one page. So we have each crop on one page. It prints out, and you can just, it's an easy report to look at, easy one to read. And then you can kind of see where you're at. And it's excellent for giving it to your lender too. And also to you, Joe, if a grower, sends you a PDF of their corn and their soybeans, and exactly what they're projecting, and then whenever they change it, that probably makes your life a little easier, doesn't it?
Yeah. Being somebody who has questions about, people come to me with questions about grain marketing, right? It's what I always tell people about prices is like something you mentioned. People pick price targets. The prices of corn, the prices of soybeans, the prices of wheat, they're just arbitrary numbers. It doesn't matter if corn is $4 a bushel or $400 a bushel. All it really matters is that cost versus what it costs you to grow it. The numbers in themselves, I mean, it's great to talk about, $4.50 corn is high because that's been the high end of the range the last 5 years. I mean, that's all well and good, but when it comes to marketing and making profitable decisions, knowing your numbers is that's like step one before you can make any sort of business decision or marketing decision. Right.
And then what we like to do based on what you're saying there too, is this is interconnected then. So this feeds into this marketing page. So right before we got online here, I just typed in a couple of examples, but let's say, we made a sale for 410 on 10,000 bushel. And like I said, like in this data group of producers that are in there, that's a 2% sale. A 40,000 bushel sale is closer to 10%. So again, it's knowing what your percent sold is. And it should be telling you right in front of that when you're looking at this, where am I at on my insured bushels sold? Because you buy insurance so that you know where you're at on this, because that's what gives you the peace of mind to make these sales ahead of time. And that tends to work pretty good a lot of the time. I mean, I'm not obviously saying this year it was a little different, but this all needs to feed back into your marketing page so you can kind of see where you're at on percent sold, how many bushels per acre by crop do you have. And so we do this is all interconnected to each crop regardless of how many crops you have. And so that's really a key thing. Then that way, if you're sitting there, looking at this and, maybe this price level wasn't quite high enough for whatever reason, you need to buy a call option or, whatever things you need to do, we can go in here in the comments, which are off to the side, you can't see, but we can go in there and we can put a position on the board, but yet tie it to specific bushels so that we don't have a disconnect between our trading account and our cash account, so that we know exactly where we're at. And so a lot of times, most of the people, when I get these profit managers back, I can kind of see what they've done on the board and where they're at with their cash position based on maybe what they spent on options or what they gained on options or whatever. So the other thing too is just knowing, again, and I said at the beginning, but knowing where this line in the sand is. And so we talked a little bit about return to management. If return to management, you're paying yourself, part of cost of production is paying yourself. And if you know that number is on this line, and we come in here and we look at, say, 200 bushel corn, and the your cost of production after you pay yourself and all your expenses is 364, and the price of corn is, $395 cash, you got to look in the mirror and say, why would I not make a sale here? And so that's why I think all of these numbers need to be interconnected back to some sort of a reporting thing to give you perspective versus maybe the perspective you have. And then this becomes reality, as opposed to perspective. And so I think that's really the key message, I guess. Any other questions on this is kind of a really fast approach to look at it. I mean, there's a ton of tools. We look at the cost of money, where your interest rate is at, and we'll punch in the bushels, and then we look at what it's costing you for the money to have those bushels in the bin. And for corn, a lot of times it's 2.5 cents, but it depends on what you're paying for interest rates. Interest rates have come down, so that's a little less of a burden now. But if interest rates were to start to climb, you really want to pay attention to that inventory. Everybody talks about gaining carry, but there's a cost of carry as well. And so you got to offset that gain in the carry by what is it costing you to carry it as well. And so we like to look at all that stuff too, and then obviously bring it all back to this. Last thing I would mention too, I think you had a question earlier, corn versus soybeans versus wheat. I don't have wheat in here.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about next year's acreage possibilities and kind of what some of the early stuff was showing you in terms of what's profitable, what's not, and what that might mean for acreage.
Yeah, I think right now I'm seeing a pretty consistent status quo on acre mix, corn versus soybeans. And we're seeing, in fact, the data that I have right now, and this is going to change because I don't have, like I said, only about 20% of our growers in this mix so far, but it's showing, $46 an acre on corn versus $31 margin on soybeans after all expenses. And so I would say, and we're using 395 and 1003. I mean, there's a lot of areas you can get quite a bit more than that 1003 and probably even more than that 395. But again, those are cash on farm prices. So they're not board of trade prices. That's cash after discounts and everything all in there. And that's kind of how we look at it. We look at this as cash. So if a person has their hedge account and things, we'll back that in either on their marketing page or, middle of the year or a couple of times a year, we'll square that up and kind of see where they're at. But I think, right now between corn and soybeans, I think people are leaning more towards going a little bit heavier on soybeans in a lot of areas, particularly in Iowa where the derecho went through. And then also some other areas, I think, versus cotton. We've got guys in the South. I think there'll be a few more soybean acres instead of cotton, and probably some corn acres too, versus the cotton from what we're seeing. But I haven't talked to many of those guys in the South yet, and I'll get smarter on that stuff here in another month or two.
Chris, I have kind of a more broad marketing question. I'm going to put back on the big screen here real quick.
Okay.
So, I'm going to play devil's advocate in regard to marketing for a second here. And I just want to see what you think. And you've been through some of this sort of stuff. So let's say since like 2014, I would say that the markets, like the corn market, the soybean market, have been kind of like walking this tightrope between profitability and no profitability. Like almost every year you're presented with prices that are profitable and then prices that are not profitable. So in that sort of environment, setting margin targets, of course, has probably worked pretty well, I would imagine. My question is this: how does this sort of marketing strategy work out for people when you get into extended bull markets or periods of profitability that last for months, if not years? Like how did this stuff work out for people back in, say, that second golden age of agriculture from 2006 through like 13? I mean, it was a lot different environment from, these numbers were a heck of a lot different back then because they were almost always profitable for a moment in time.
Mm-hmm. So 2008, I'll say through about 2012, a lot of people would yawn when we'd start trying to put these numbers together.
Right.
There were a couple of years where all you had to do is wake up and make money. You were making money. So people would have a tendency not to pay attention to that conversely, we had some clients that paid attention to that and capitalized on those opportunities. Mm-hmm. Right. So you could make money, but how much more could you make? It was exponential on even more by managing that same scenario with even more opportunity. I would also answer the question by saying, 87% of the time in the last, and this 87% I'm giving you is not statistical. So I just ran some really quick math on this, but about 87% of the time in the last 4 years, our clients have been in the red.
Mm-hmm. Oh, wow.
So there's a very short period of time, which a lot of times it's like in June or July, mm-hmm. or maybe in January, you have like a couple of days, when you could actually, or should have maybe pulled the trigger on like 60 or 70%, but nobody knows that ahead of the crop being produced. So you sit there with all this time with not very much opportunity. To answer your question, though, back on the, how did everybody do when it was profitable? One thing I will tell you is in 2012, nobody wanted to sell 13 corn for $2 less than what the price of the corn was in 2012. Yep. It was it was $7.50, and who in the heck was going to sell corn for $5.50?
Yeah.
Who's that stupid that they'd sell corn for $5.50?
Yep.
I don't know how many times I heard that. In 13,
you got the same thing. You got the same thing in soybeans going on right now. I mean, exactly. You've got your buy futures at 11, well over 11 and a half, and $1 cheaper for next year.
Yeah, that's why you need to put together your 2021 forecast and make decisions independent of the past. Mm-hmm. What's your qualification at the bottom of all these lines? Past performance doesn't predict the future,
Definitely does not. There's a lot of truth to that.
Yeah. So you have to run your numbers in real time, and you have to make the best decisions you can with the information you have. I mean, I've got a number of our kids were in the military, and they've told me numerous times, we don't go into battle, or you don't go into a mission with 100% of the information. If you waited for 100% of the mission, you would get slaughtered. Because you would never be able to move forward and to achieve the objective. And, if you wait for too much information, so you get to 30, 50% of the information, you better start making some decisions. And so that's really, I think, applicable to marketing as well.
In a market like we're in right now, which is, we're in bull market territory in these row crops. The biggest obstacle to marketing always is fear of missing out on those higher prices. It really is. And it's even, I think whether your numbers or not, it's probably still an obstacle.
Yeah. You talk about fear, it's fear and greed.
It's both.
Fear, but fear is the biggest one. I mean, if you're really honest with I sell on fear. I always do. And I know that. So you got to diagnose yourself first of all, and you got to figure out how you make decisions and why you make them. I'm always afraid that I'm not going to be able to sell at a profit level. And so when I get in the black, I tend to sell too much. But you need to understand yourself. You need to figure out what you do and what you maybe do that you could improve on, and then slowly try to manage yourself that way. And everybody had to recalibrate themselves after 2008 through 2012. I mean, it was a total recalibration, and maybe we'll all have to recalibrate. I hope we all have to recalibrate a little bit. But the thing that happened from 2008, 2012 is all of these costs followed along. And so, we had a lot of higher commodity prices, but we also had an increasing crop protection price. We had increasing seed costs. We had increasing land costs. We had increasing machinery and equipment costs. And all those things follow along to a degree that we live in a commodity business with a margin that has to be managed. And so, I mean, that's really the key, is knowing that, we can all wish for $5 corn, but I'll bet you $100 what's going to happen 2 minutes later is we're going to see some price increases on every single one of those line item areas as well. It's going to be it's going to be time to pay a little bit more for seed, a little bit more for that combine trade. The wife's kitchen might need updated, because prices are higher. The land rent's going to go up a little bit. And so it's a margin business. We just got to manage it.
Yeah. So what do you think going into 2021? I mean, given this kind of odd, like contra-seasonal type thing that we saw in the markets this year, what kind of obstacle do you think that presents? Is this going to keep people from making forward sales next year because they saw this late season rally? Is it going to steer people in the wrong direction, do you think? I think that's a possibility personally.
Yeah, I think it is, because I've talked to a few people that have zero sold for 2021, and I don't give marketing advice because I don't know where it's going. I leave it up to you to.
Well, I don't know either. So.
To tell us what to think. But, the reality of it is, almost everyone that I've ran so far is in the black for 2021.
Yeah.
Last year, people were starting out selling corn 40 cents lower. They were starting out selling soybeans a couple bucks lower. So why would we not start here? I don't know. I mean,
I remember even over the summer, there were people selling 21 corn at a loss already this past summer because things looked so hopeless before this rally. I mean, it's just amazing how fantastic or how quickly things can change. I mean, it's just absolutely phenomenal how these markets can change, how just the whole overall setup can change. That's why knowing your numbers is so important. I mean, it's important to know how those big shifts impact your business,
Yeah. And when you look at 2020, as crappy as this year was from a whole bunch of reasons, derecho, COVID, all kinds of things. We're very, very blessed as producers to have had some of the financial aid come in that has come in, because that's literally the margin. Most of our clients, or most anybody listening to this, you can go back, and if you subtract any of the additional revenue off the top, you're probably in the red, or you're probably barely breaking even. Those who aren't probably didn't sell anything and probably wouldn't be using this tool anyway, because we were forecasting as these payments were coming in, we knew what they were, and then we knew what we could make some sales at. Some of the people who didn't make sales, though, it's interesting and see what you're seeing. But one of the things that we've noticed is that people who started selling way too soon, and by way too soon, and can I show you another page, and I can bring this up real quick?
Yeah, bring it up.
This other slide. So this slide right here, I just put this on here today. This is Dees 21 corn, and it's the database we just looked at, right? And so I talked about a margin target. So here's an example. If your margin target for your farm operation is 24 cents a bushel, or in this case, $47 an acre is where you would set your margin target to begin sales, then that would be a $3.95 sale. If we've got basis of 15 cents, that would be a board price of $4.10. Okay. And that's shooting for a margin target or ROI of 6.5%, which was on the profit manager that you just looked at, or at 196 bushel an acre up here on the right. Okay. That cost of production on the tool you just looked at was $3.71 a bushel. And these are all cash prices, except for this board price here. So what you have to look at is, I showed you your break-even sales price at every yield level. Well, if your yield goes up by 10 bushel, guess what happens here? This thing moves down.
Yep.
All of a sudden now your line is moving down here. So what I like to do with this line is, if your yield's going down, or you think this yield's too lofty, then move it up a little bit. But you need to be looking out in history. Or not in history, but you need to be looking out into the future, is what I'm saying. All this stuff back here has already happened. It's too late.
Right.
But if you take this arrow and you say, okay, I'm going to put this out in front of the market, and I'm going to say, okay, my cost of production is $3.71. Okay, anytime these markets are above this line, again, you got to look in the mirror and say, why would I not start making sales? And again, that line's different for everybody. This is just an average of some people, some operations that I have in here right now.
Right.
What's your line? That's the key, is answering that question to yourself. What is your line? Where do you need to start? And once you know that, it does take a lot of the emotion out of it. And then I can go to somebody like you, Joe, and say, all right, I need to, I don't want to do it all in cash sales. Maybe I want to buy some puts, or maybe I made some cash sales, but I want to leave the top side open, or whatever it is. You can do those things then and feel confident about what you're doing, because you know what you're spending. as it relates to those individual bushels in a unit perspective. So
yeah. And that's why I wanted to do this conversation today, because it's one thing for people to say, yeah, know your numbers, right? We've heard that a million times, but it's another thing for a person to actually go through every single one of those line items and be accurate with the numbers, and especially the more complicated things that you mentioned, like machinery, for example. It's really a lot more complicated than it sounds. I mean, know your numbers. Okay, that's fine. I know my numbers. It's not simple. It's not a simple thing. It's just like grain marketing is not simple. I mean, it's maybe in hindsight, it's simple to say, yeah, I should have sold here, should have sold there, but this stuff is incredibly complicated. I mean, everything about it is.
Yeah, but it's very doable, and it's a matter of time. And one statement that I always make, and I think people I work with probably get tired of me saying this, but we all spend so much time working in our business. I mean, every farmer I work with is phenomenal at growing a crop. I mean, they're amazing, and they know all of their hybrids and their crop protection and the different, herbicides and fungicides and, which technologies and what variety and all that kind of stuff. But the amount of time that is spent on the agronomic side, which is critically important, if we could just take a little bit more of that time and move it over into the marketing side, and I'm guilty of this myself, and I do this stuff a lot. And so, it is just ask ourselves, how much time are we spending? And you need to really get this cost side dialed in first, and then transition that time over. But we spend so much time working on, in the business, out in the shop or doing whatever. How much time do you spend working on the business? And when you're working on the business, your pay goes up by about 10%, by about tenfold. So if you're making, $20 or $25 an hour in the shop, take that times 10 if you're in the office doing some of this planning. I mean, my wife's always really good at it, and I'm not as bad as I used to be, but I'd want to go out and shop and work. And she'd be like, you're out there doing that $20 an hour stuff. You could be in the office doing $200 or $300 or $400 an hour stuff, which is very true. And I think that's something we all got to be cognizant of.
Yeah, I did a podcast episode a while back. I think I called it 5 minutes a day. And I said, a lot of guys don't even spend 5 minutes a day looking at their spreadsheets or their marketing. And if they did, even if it was just 5 minutes, that would be probably a big improvement for a lot of people.
Yeah. And that's where it doesn't have to be Profit Manager, but you need to have this tool, some type of a tool where you have that information in front of you and you have it connected to your marketing. You have it on, right on the front page of your computer. So you click on it, it's on the front of it. So it's just right there. It's quick and easy, and it's open all the time. So when you sit down at your computer, it's there, and then it's top of mind all the time. So I think it's key.
Hey, Chris, do you want to bring your website up for us real quick? I want everybody who's watching to know where to go if they're interested in taking a look at this software that you offer. I know your business is called AgView Solutions. And if you're watching on YouTube or on Facebook, I've got the link to Chris's website in the description on both Facebook and YouTube, I think. So you should be able to find it. But I'll have Chris pull it up. And I think you said you have a demo, don't you?
Yeah. So if you go on our web page here, you can kind of see this Profit Manager. There's a tutorial there. It's more fun to watch too. I just had a grower call me from Illinois earlier today, and he said, I really liked the video a lot. The thing I liked most about it is how high the prices were. So when I did the video, the prices were quite a bit higher even than they are now. So you'd be happy looking at the numbers anyway.
Great. Well, Chris, thank you for coming on with me tonight. If anybody has any questions for Chris, you've got his contact info there. If you have questions for me, shoot me an email to info@standardgrain.com, or you can leave it in the comment section on YouTube or on Facebook, and I'll get back to you. Chris, you got anything else to add here?
I don't. I think I just appreciate the opportunity to be on here. And if anybody has any questions or needs anything, probably the easiest way to get a hold of me is text me or give a call, 319-533-5703. And, if you got specific questions or want to know more, feel free to call me.
Very good. That's all I got. So everybody have a nice night. Chris, thanks again. We'll catch you guys next time.
All right.